The most visited article at our website by a long measure. As a matter of fact, if I check my statistics and the activity at the website at any given time, there's always somebody, 2, 3, 4 people reading this article. And we're going to be talking about it because I think it's of interest to both skeptics and believers who wonder, is there any evidence for Christianity outside of the Bible? Is there any evidence for the existence of Jesus outside the Bible? So I've got everything staged here. You should see my desk. It's filled with computer monitor screens, all of which contain information. We're going to try today to go through the evidence for Jesus outside of the Bible from ancient sources as a way to kind of make a case for the historicity of Jesus. But before I do that, and we're going to do it in 2 different groups, both unfriendly, pagan, either Greek or Roman or Syrian sources, and then we'll also do it from unfriendly Jewish sources, which are kind of in a separate category. So we'll do that today. But before I start, I want to talk about a couple of issues that I think are raised by even asking this question. When someone asks you, is there any evidence for Jesus outside of Scripture? If you really stop and think about it, that question wouldn't even be asked if they took the Gospels as serious historical accounts. Clearly, when someone says, yeah, that's great, that I see what it says in the Gospels and in the New Testament about Jesus, but do you have anything outside of Scripture? Well, what they're really saying is, I don't trust that your Scripture is accurate, and I don't trust that it can even be called history in any way. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I think that realistically, that's why I wrote Cold Case Christianity, was in an effort to say, well, why would we think that this is not reliable eyewitness testimony? Why would we think that these accounts don't include the accurate observations of people who actually knew Jesus? And I think if you're saying, well, I can only accept versions of the Jesus story written by those people who were not friends of Jesus, that's a silly approach to take. I've talked about it in the past here on this show. I've talked about it in my public speaking engagements. But the reality of it is that the people who knew Jesus best, who could give us the kind of intimate details that are available to us in the New Testament Gospels, they became part of the inner circle of Jesus. And in the end, they became Christians, Christ followers, based on what they saw Jesus do for all those years. And then they wrote an account. So, for example, you might say, well, I don't trust that the Gospel of John's reliable because, John was a disciple of John the Baptist and he was kind of a friend of the movement, and at least in the sense of kind of expecting the coming Messiah that John the Baptist foretold. Okay, fine. Let's kick him out then. And I don't trust, that Peter giving the account to Mark, which is now in Mark's Gospel, he was kind of like John, a disciple of John. Okay, fine. But what do you do with Matthew? Matthew's a guy who was named Levi, who was a tax collector, who was no friend of the Christian movement, really no friend of anybody. As a matter of fact, most people who knew him did not like him, given his occupation as a tax collector. And Jesus finds him not as part of the discipleship of John the Baptist or not a part of any friend group, and he brings him into the fold. And after 3 years of watching what Jesus did, Matthew became a believer and then wrote an account. But he doesn't start off trying, in other words, to say that this is, in many ways you could argue, this is an unfriendly account, at least initially. This is not somebody who was a friend of Jesus. He became a believer of Jesus based on what he saw. And it's very different to argue that somebody's writing something based on some pre-existing bias or simply just based on what they saw that then turned them into a believer. So the problem we have with the ancient accounts is all of those folks, whether they were initially friends of Christianity or not, initially were expecting the coming Messiah based on what John the Baptist had told them, or otherwise, anyone who knew Jesus well enough to write an account ended up becoming. Now, you might say, well, boy, I wish that the Gospel of Judas was actually accurate. There is a Gospel of Judas. It's just a very late, it's not a true gospel. It's written very late by people who didn't even know much about the truth of Jesus, other than what they had read in the reliable Gospels. And so, but he would be the one person, I guess you could say, Judas, if he had actually written an account before hanging himself, he would be the one person you could say, well, this is no friend of Jesus, but he did write a story about Jesus. Well, it turns out his story is included in the Gospel of Matthew. And the reality is that Matthew was just a stranger to Jesus who became a follower, wrote an account because of what he saw. So the first thing I want to clarify is that most of the time when I'm asked for evidence for Jesus outside of the Gospels, what they're really saying is, I don't trust the Gospels. And I would say, okay, fine. Then let's put the Gospels to the test. That 4-part template that I often use with eyewitnesses, that's what I did to decide if I could trust what the Gospels said. But even if you didn't have the Gospels, even if you didn't have a single Christian document of the Church Fathers or anybody else, and all you had were the earliest statements of non-believers, you would know an awful lot about Jesus. And this is why even ardent skeptics like Bart Ehrman, who rejects Christianity, he still would argue, though, for the historicity of Jesus, that he was a real person who lived based on the kind of evidence we're going to talk about today. One last thing. We're going to use accounts that are as close to the life of Jesus as possible. But you might notice that some of these are, all of these are obviously after the resurrection, after the crucifixion, after the death and resurrection of Jesus. So you might say, well, I can't, I'm looking for something that's so ancient, it codates, it coexisted with the Gospels, or it was part of the earliest stories of Jesus. A couple of things about that. First of all, the Gospels themselves were not written immediately. They were written as the disciples realized they were going to be dying and not being able to transfer the story orally. And now these Gospels began to get written. So we have a gap of time before we have the accounts that are in the Scripture. But in addition to that, if you were to ask me today, if I was to do a show talking about the history of Abraham Lincoln, and I was to tell you all the stories about Abraham, and then 1,000 years from now, you discovered this little video, and you had no other information about Abraham Lincoln. You didn't have the sources that I am referencing, the sources that I am thinking about as I'm telling you about Abraham Lincoln. You might be inclined to say, well, then I can't believe in Abraham Lincoln because I only have the word of Jim Wallace 150 years after the man was dead. But clearly, I'm close enough to the action to be able to source back the information to Abraham Lincoln and determine that the story of Abraham Lincoln is historically reliable. Now, I will tell you about it being only 150 years separated from it, not even that far separated from people who actually wrote about Abraham Lincoln, who died later on. Some of them died in the early 20th century. So these sources describing Abraham Lincoln are still apparently available to me. Now, when I discover an ancient account, say it's Greek or it's Roman, and it's following the life of Jesus by 30, 40, 50, let's say even 100 years, we need to give it the same kind of consideration you would give my statement about Abraham Lincoln, given that I apparently have access to resources that I am referring to, and I'm speaking to you today in 2015 as somebody who is committed to the story of Abraham Lincoln as though it's historically reliable because I happen to still have access to the sources that demonstrate for me that it's historically reliable. And even if you don't have what I had in order to determine the reliability of Abraham Lincoln, you ought to listen to my story and give it some weight. Now, we're going to do the same thing with early stories in the 1st century, 2nd century about Jesus. And although they may follow the story of Jesus for some period of time, the people who were not Christians who wrote about Jesus apparently were determined and were committed to the fact that Jesus really lived because they wrote about him as though he did really live. And like me, with my connection to Abraham Lincoln, they had some connection to sources about Jesus. And that's where we will begin our study.